Okay, everybody, welcome. Let's get started. I want to welcome people who are in the room, and what I'm reliably informed are some hundreds of people who are online as well. So welcome to everybody. I'm Daniel Kanstrom, the Faculty Director of the Rappaport Center for Law and Public Policy here at BC Law School, and together with our Executive Director, Lissy Medvedow, and our Administrative Assistant, Abby Chingo, it's my great pleasure to welcome you to our final event of this semester, also the first day of the rest of our lives, however, so we'll continue. Our topic for today is reparations, which, as I'm sure most of you are aware, presents an incredible array of complex and deeply significant issues, some moral, some historical, some jurisprudential and legal, and many local and practice and policy oriented. And I think we're going to get a flavor of all of those issues because we have an amazing panel to explore those things. In that sense, I think the topic is a perfect culmination of our fall programming, which has already included a stirring, inspirational presentation by our distinguished visiting Professor Jeffrey Robinson entitled Who We Are, A Chronicle of Racism in America. It's also included a fantastic panel about peremptory challenges that explored court efforts nationwide to combat racial bias. Another presentation by Jeff that looked at the historical and continuing struggles over Confederate monuments. A co-sponsored event that brought Art Spiegelman, the author of Mouse, to BC. And a wonderful author meets reader event about substantive due process and the Dobbs case. So please do check our website for more information about these past programs and also about upcoming events. I also want to mention this event is being recorded, so for those of you in the room, you should know if you ask questions, you may be recorded while doing it. Now, the scope of questions surrounding the current progress and controversies regarding reparations is, as I say, obviously quite broad, and it implicates many of the most important issues of our time. But we are lucky to have an amazing panel of experts to engage with these questions from various vantage points. And I want to heartily thank our Boston College Black Law Students Association for co-sponsoring today's panel. All I'm going to do is introduce our moderator because I want to leave the maximum amount of time for our panelists to engage with these issues. So let me do that. Our moderator, who generously moderated an excellent Attorney General's debate for us last year, for which we thank her again, and she will then introduce the panelists. So our moderator is Kimberly Atkins Stohr, who is a senior opinion writer and columnist at the Boston Globe. That's a newspaper for those of you who forgot. I still carry one around, but I think I may be the last man standing with the paper version. And she's a lead columnist for The Emancipator, which is a joint venture by Globe Opinion and the Boston University Center for Anti-Racist Research that reimagines 19th century abolitionist newspapers to reframe the current national conversation on racial justice. She authors The Emancipator's newsletter, which is entitled Unbound. She's an MSNBC contributor, a guest host for the NPR WBUR-produced news program On Point, and co-host of the weekly Politico-Legal news podcast, #SistersInLaw. Before that, she was the first Washington, D.C.-based news correspondent for WBUR and has served as the Boston Herald's Washington bureau chief, guest host of C-SPAN's morning call-in show Washington Journal, and as a Supreme Court reporter for Massachusetts Lawyers Weekly and its sister publications. Kimberly has appeared as a political commentator on many national and international television and radio networks, including CNN, Fox News, NBC News, PBS, NPR, Sky News in the UK, and CBC News, which is in Canada. And she knows law both as a lawyer and as a journalist because before launching this stellar journalism career, she was a trial and appellate litigation attorney in Boston. She's a native of Michigan, a graduate of Wayne State University. She made the tragic error of attending Boston University School of Law. She seems to have overcome that problem as well. And she attended the Boston University College of Communication and the Columbia University Graduate School of Journalism. Please join me in welcoming Kimberly Atkins.
For that more than generous introduction. I'm going to make much briefer introductions of our panel, because if I gave such an extensive introduction, that would take up the entire time of our discussion. But you do have their full bios in your materials associated with this program, so you can refer to that as well. I want to begin with Michele Miller. Michele is an Amherst, Massachusetts town councilor and co-chair of the African Heritage Reparation Assembly, or the AHRA. In August 2020, she co-founded Reparations for Amherst, a grassroots organization focused on reparations for slavery and post-slavery anti-Black racism at Amherst. And then next we have Jeffrey Robinson. He is the Rappaport Distinguished Visiting Professor at BC for the fall 2022 semester. He's also CEO of the Who We Are Project and writer of the documentary Who We Are, A Chronicle of Racism in America. And he has 4 decades of experience working on criminal and racial justice issues, including part of that time spent with the ACLU as Deputy Legal Director and Director of the ACLU's Trone Center for Justice and Equality. And then next, we have Kamilah Moore. She's the chair of the California Reparations Task Force. She is a reparatory justice scholar and an attorney, also specializing in entertainment and intellectual property transactions, and she has deep experience on the issues of domestic and international human rights issues, including, but not limited to, racial inequality. And last but not least, we have Professor Thomas Mitchell, the new BC Law professor and winner of the 2020 MacArthur Award. He holds the Robert F. Drinan S.J. Endowed Chair at BC Law and serves as the director of the Initiative on Promoting Land and Housing Rights, which seeks to help disadvantaged people and communities acquire and secure important property rights. And he's a national expert on property issues facing disadvantaged families and communities. And I just want to say, we will save some time at the end of this program. If you are here in person, we will answer your questions live. And if you are joining us remotely, you can use the Q&A function to submit your questions. That's why I'm sitting here in front of a laptop. This is a live program. This is the new hybrid world that we live in, so I'm doing a lot of things here, and we're doing things differently, but we're very grateful for both our in-person and our virtual audience. So I want to start off by giving everyone just a few minutes to make some opening remarks as we talk about the very complex and complicated and controversial issue of reparations in all the ways that manifests. I'm going to go in reverse order and start first with Professor Mitchell.
Sure, thank you. Thank you for the organizers. Really happy to be on this panel. So just a couple comments. We're going to hear a lot of different perspectives, different issues about reparations. So I'm going to talk about some issues that I think that are important that may or may not be addressed by my fellow panelists. So one of the things that, in terms of the reparations movement, that does seem to be picking up steam, all right, as compared to, 25, 30 years ago, is instead of just this kind of vague, kind of generalized notion, in some places we're starting to have meat put on the bones, and it manifests itself in different ways, right? So we have somebody here from Amherst, Massachusetts. I spent 4 years there at one point in my life, decades ago. And so we're starting to have local movements in places like Amherst and some other cities across the country. We have a case out of Southern California, Manhattan Beach, the Bruce's Beach case, first black family to actually get land back that was misappropriated by a unit of government, in that case the city of Manhattan Beach, abusing eminent domain law, using it as a pretext to take land from this family, land that has a current appraised value of $21 million when this family was only paid $14,500 for it. We're also starting to have some academic study to try to put an economic value on different subsets of the African American population in terms of what was the damage that they suffered, right? And I think these studies, although I wouldn't say they're required, if you don't have them, it dilutes your moral claim. They're certainly helpful, and I think they're helpful in a number of ways, including setting boundaries in terms of an economic payment or some type of benefit that is called reparations, allowing us to have a better metric to assess whether or not that is symbolic damages, that is some meaningful form of compensation, or if that rises to the level of what we call a fuller set of kind of restitution, right? So I think that's important. As kind of the lawyer and some of the work I do on kind of land and property preservation, I do want to just make this last point, and I think that I've seen very little attention on this. So if there were to be reparations and a transfer of any significant amount of money, right, that potentially could be a Pyrrhic victory if there's not the infrastructure that underlines that enables people to then preserve and leverage whatever wealth that is transferred. So for example, let me just give you, and I see some of my fellow Trust and Estate students, I'm actually a student with them this semester. In the African American community, in terms of legal community, there's a chronic underrepresentation of black transactional attorneys. I interviewed a lawyer in Portland, Oregon, a couple years ago who told me that in the entire state of Oregon, there are only 5 African American attorneys who do any significant estate planning practices. Having those practices help people build and preserve wealth, have continuity of ownership across several generations. And there's this real danger that if you don't have that infrastructure, you could have an immediate cash transfer and quickly a cash depletion. We have historical antecedents for that. Native Americans who had their tribal land allotted. Okay, so that was under the Dawes Act of 1887. They immediately lost 60 million acres of land. But then those individual families who were given allotments varying from about 60 acres to 140 acres, 90% of that was lost within a generation, and for fire sale prices, because they did not have legal representation. They didn't have transactional attorneys. They didn't have tax attorneys. They didn't have real estate attorneys to help them preserve that wealth. So that's something I've seen almost no discussion. I also see a parallel in the Great Recession where there was a lot of celebration, including places like the Ford Foundation. Around 2004, the high water mark for black home ownership was reached in this country. It was about 49.5%. And there was this great celebration without paying attention to the details. Like, how were these black families getting these properties? What were the mortgages like? There were all kinds of kooky, mortgage instruments that nobody paid attention to. And when it ended up being realized that these were like junk mortgages, these families lost hundreds of billions of dollars. And only after that was some greater attention paid to what is the foundation, what are the basic pillars in terms of having that type of asset, preserving it and leveraging it. So I think that's important. I hear in almost no reparations discussion that piece of it, and that worries me because of this concern of what I call like a Pyrrhic victory.
Sure. Hi everyone, as Kimberly said, my name is Kamilah Moore and I'm the chairperson of the First in the Nation California Reparations Task Force. Our full title is a long one. It's the California Reparations Task Force to study and develop reparations proposals for African Americans with a special consideration for African Americans who are descendants of persons enslaved in the United States. The task force is an official state body or commission. We also serve as a legislative advisory body. So what that means is while we don't have the power to actually give out reparations, we do have the power to adjudicate the merits and provide final proposals that we will then turn to the California State Legislature at the end of the life of the task force, which ends June of next year. And then it will be up to the state legislature to turn our final proposals into actual legislation, and then it will be up to the governor of California to enact them into law. So just to give some brief context about how the commission or the task force came to be, grassroots organizations worked alongside state legislator Shirley Weber when she was still in the Assembly. She's now California's first African-American Secretary of State. And again, these grassroots organizations worked alongside Shirley Weber to implement a statute called AB 3121, which was passed and signed by Governor Gavin Newsom in October 2020. So that legislation gave life to the task force. So we are a 2-year commission. I characterize the first year, we started our first meeting June of 2021. So our first year I characterize as the study phase, where we studied the various different atrocities against the African American community, starting with the transatlantic slave trade to the institution of slavery to more contemporary atrocities against the African American community. And over that first year, between June of 2021 and June of 2022, we heard over 40 hours of testimony, personal and expert testimony, where we invited folks to testify on these different issues. We heard from over 103 witnesses, 16 hours of public comment, and we received over 1,000 emails and 100 phone calls. And again, since June of last year and June of this year, we've held a series of public hearings on, again, a variety of issues, again, from the transatlantic slave trade, the institution of slavery, gentrification, and homelessness, discrimination in housing, banking, tax and labor. Given that we are in California, we held a public hearing on discrimination in entertainment, sports, arts, and culture. We held hearings on discrimination in technology, the criminal legal system, unequal and separate education. And then as a 9-member task force, we also came to decide who we think should be eligible for reparations, which we can maybe get into later. But to clarify, we classified the eligibility, the community of eligibility being those who are African Americans, who are descendants of freed and enslaved people, black people in the United States prior to 1900. And so again, the first year of our work, the study phase, is forever memorialized and enshrined in an interim report that we released June 1 of this year. It's almost 500 pages, 13 chapters, and each chapter is characterized as a badge and incident of slavery, or 12 major areas of systemic discrimination that still impact African Americans today. And so in this next and final year of our work, I characterize as the development stage, where we are transitioning out of the study phase and are now having substantive and intentional conversations amongst the 9-member task force about what the final proposal should look like. Because in terms of our next work product, we have a final report that will be released or published July 1 of 2023. I just want to also highlight, yes, while I am the chairperson of the task force, I am so proud to lead the task force. But I'm so proud of who I am on the task force with. The vice chair, for instance, is Pastor Amos Brown, who is on the board of directors for the NAACP, was one of the only 13 students to be taught by Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. at Morehouse. He is a stalwart in the black community. We also have Don Tamaki, who's a member of the task force. He is known to be the lawyer who helped to overturn Korematsu versus the United States. He also was a key movement leader in ensuring that Japanese internment survivors received reparations from the Ronald Reagan administration in the 80s. We also have many other different people on the task force, like Cheryl Bruce, who is a renowned psychologist, two legislators, Reggie Jones Sawyer, Senator Bradford, and many, many other people. So again, I'm really excited to be here and to continue the conversation.
So good evening. My name is Jeff Robinson, and I think what I want to say at this point is that there may be a controversy about reparations, or reparations may be controversial, but there is no controversy based in logic and fact about whether reparations should be given. If you understand and recognize the history in this country, it's just not really something that is open to dispute. especially when we've already heard of one instance of reparations in America where Japanese Americans who were imprisoned for 3.5 years, who lost land and dignity, were given $1.6 billion in 1988 that didn't come close to compensating them for everything that they lost. But that $1.6 billion came with a national apology, an admission that what was done from racism and ignorance, not national security. But, as we heard from our first speaker, one of the things that plan had nothing, had no representation with was any kind of infrastructure to help with what that reparations payment may have led to. The first instance of reparations shows that we know we can and should make reparations for slavery because Abraham Lincoln gave Washington, D.C. owners of enslaved people $1 million in 1862 money for lost property. The lost property was because he passed that bill about 6 or 7 months before the Emancipation Proclamation. And he knew he wanted to keep D.C.'s owners of enslaved people loyal. So he paid them a whole bunch of money in reparations before he freed the enslaved people that they quote-unquote owned. So the history is one that compels a look at reparations. That is just not controversial. And H.R. 40, the bill that is before Congress right now, anticipates a commission that would study the issue and then make reparatory legislative recommendations to Congress. Not exactly like what happened in California, but I think the California model is similar to what H.R. 40 has been for some time. That commission, in my view, is the brilliant thing and the necessary thing. And I can tell you that our first speaker should have a seat on that commission, because what we want are experts from around the country who can look at this problem and think of things that need to be considered before we do it, as opposed to after we do it. The last thing I'll say is, many people say, well, you're saying there's no controversy, but it sure is complex. It sure is difficult to figure out. And my answer to that is, I thought this was supposed to be America, where we can figure out anything if we put our minds to it. So the movement forward on this issue is at a place where it's never been before. It will be very interesting to see where it goes.
Michele? Hi everyone, I'm Michele Miller and I'm a town councilor from Amherst, Massachusetts. I'm really honored to be here. As Kimberly said, the effort in Amherst, Massachusetts started with a grassroots movement in 2020. And that then led to the creation of a municipal committee as well as a dedicated reparation fund for the town of Amherst. I guess what I want to talk about, listening to the other speakers, is with a local reparations movement, and I think that Amherst, behind and following, I should say, Evanston, is the second municipality in the country to pass reparations legislation. So one of the lessons, or one of the things that we're learning in Amherst, is the importance of scaffolding. And so through a process of, in our case, we began with a petition that went out to the community. That petition gave us a sense of where people were at with respect to reparations, and started to build the support from the ground. And then we moved to a resolution, which was essentially a speech act that we asked the town council to pass, apologizing for anti-Black structural racism and committing to a path of repair and remedy. And then from there, and I think Thomas was speaking to the importance of collecting data. When it comes to local reparations initiatives, it's really important to look at the history of your community, look at the current disparities in your community in various education, housing, income, health, And so we collected data and coupled that with a resolution, which then gave us the support that we needed for the town council to create a commission to study and develop proposals, as well as a dedicated reparation fund. So most recently, our town council has approved a $2 million commitment for the dedicated fund over a 10-year period. It certainly is not enough, but it's a wonderful start, and we will build on it. And so we're in the consultative process with our residents of African heritage. We're out in the community beginning to engage and talk to the harmed community about what it is they would like to see in this reparations plan. And I work alongside of 6 African heritage residents in the community on the African Heritage Reparation Assembly. So I'll stop there and then.
Great, great.
Yeah.
And I want to encourage all of our panelists who are the experts here to engage with one another. I'm more of a traffic cop here as we navigate this issue, which can be complex. But I just want to start off the top then, because when I write about reparations or talk about it in any sort of media form, immediately there is feedback by people who either don't understand what it is, people who believe that the word means making people today pay for something that they didn't do or that happened in the past, or people saying, look, my ancestors came here with nothing, we faced all kinds of discrimination, and nobody's giving reparations to us. So I just want to give you all a few minutes just to discuss why this is important, why, as Jeff said, is this a matter of essential American justice? And what is your response to people who either don't fully understand or who have opposition because descendants of enslaved people in America are not the only people who have received unfair treatment in this nation? Anyone want to kick that off?
Well, I'll say this about the argument that, well, I, as a white person, came to America after slavery. My family came after slavery. We had nothing to do with slavery, and so there's so many Americans that are in that situation, it's just not fair. And there's a documentary called Traces of the Trade. It was made by, and I can't remember the woman's name right now, but she made this documentary. She has ancestors that were some of the largest owners of enslaved people in America, and she has ancestors that came after slavery. And what she says about that argument is this. What people tend to forget is that people immigrated to America after the Civil War because there were jobs. And there were jobs because there was a booming economy. And there was a booming economy because it was built on unpaid labor. And so if you came to America after the Civil War to take advantage of this opportunity for freedom, what you were taking advantage of had a rotten foundation. And so I think that's one way to explain to people how that distancing argument doesn't really work. And the concept that I can't be blamed for something I didn't do. No one alive today was enslaved. No one alive today enslaved anyone. And so there's no entity that's to be held responsible. Well, there is one entity that was alive then and is alive now, and that's the United States government. And the United States government was neck deep into the institution of slavery. And that is the exact same government that sits in Washington, D.C. right now. So the argument is not about us and whether we did something, whether individuals did something. The argument is about a system.
I'll add, if you look at AB 3121, which again is a legislative statute that created the task force, grassroots organizers actually put into that statute language that says, in the event that California does give out reparations, it does not preempt or prevent the federal government from also being responsible. So that language was put in there to highlight and clarify that reparations is first and foremost a federal responsibility. At the same time, California, or states rather, and localities can still do what they can to atone and repair for their own, sanctioned atrocities against the African American community. I'll just say this one thing. In my work, I encounter the question, why California? Because I think the general idea is that, well, didn't California enter into the Union as a free state? So what is the purpose of California, having this type of task force? And very early on, in our first substantive hearing in September of last year, the task force worked to disrupt that myth and that narrative. We invited people to provide expert testimony, like Professor Stacy Smith out of Oregon State University, who has dedicated her career in studying California's role in perpetuating the institution of slavery. And so we found out early on that over 1,500 black people were actually enslaved on California's soil. Not only that, a lot of people don't know that the California state legislature, 2 years after it was admitted into the Union in 1850, so in 1852, the state legislature actually enacted a fugitive slave law. That was actually much more aggressive than the federal fugitive slave law that was on the books at the time. So the actual implications of that were, if you were so happened to be free in California at that time, a free black person in California at that time, you could be deported to be re-enslaved in the South. That happened to many different black people in the state, or you could be enslaved on California soil. So I just wanted to bring that education to the room for folks who are wondering, why is California doing this?
Yeah, and I would say three things. It's undeniable in our society. We've had durable racial gaps in the carceral state, in education, in health, and the wealth gap. There's also been durable white privilege, and that's just like a fact, right? And second, sometimes in some of my work or some of the policy work I've done, you have kind of this pushback that, well, I didn't discriminate against African Americans, right? So one of these examples is the Biden administration tried to build upon cases from the early 2000s where African American farmers got some payment for past discrimination. But there was a recognition when the administration began its work that was wholly incomplete. So they initially tried to make available $4 billion to black farmers in recognition of the systemic racism those farmers experienced. Immediately, several white farmers filed all kinds of lawsuits. They've gummed up the entire payment. Not a penny has been paid. And oftentimes those farmers said, well, I didn't discriminate. But what that elides and what that ignores is by driving out black farmers as potential competitors in that space, these farmers, by definition, benefited, right? And so there's oftentimes this confusion about responsibility, right? And then I'd say that, I had a number of media interviews coming out of that Bruce's Beach case, but one was this reporter who had this kind of fixation once again that, well, she saw that there was going to be a slippery slope. And she thought the case was very dangerous because if this family gets their property back, well, where are we going to stop, right? And once again, she said, I think she had come from Russia. That I had never discriminated against. So why is the government doing this, right? And I said, well, there's making that distinction between kind of you as an individual in this kind of atomistic way and you being part of society. So, for example, when there is a unit of government, right, acts with gross negligence that may result in somebody's home being burned down, the government pays. That's our taxpayers' money, right? We don't then say that there's only going to be a payment in those instances if we can find culpability in each individual citizen. That's just not how our government works, right? So I think that same principle applies in these cases where you have individuals said that I never did anything to disparage, to discriminate, to subordinate. That's not how our government works, right? It's not how our society works. So we shouldn't then carve out this exception and say when we're dealing with African Americans, we're going to have a whole different rule, a whole different regime, a whole different structure of how government works.
So I want to talk a little bit about how successful efforts at reparations might be replicated in different communities, because it will look different on the state and local level, and it will look different in communities. So I want to talk a little bit about the Bruce's Beach case and also the California legislation, the Amherst efforts. What about those do you think can be replicated or learned from for other communities, so that these are not just individual piecemeal efforts, but that they can lead to a more broader effort?
I think one of the first things I did when we were considering an effort in Amherst was to call former Alderwoman Robin Simmons, who was already leading the effort, and to ask, what are you doing in Evanston? What have you done? What has been successful or not successful? And really building a sort of pool of knowledge and pulling from each other. Each community, as Kimberly said, will be unique. And in particular, Amherst is a majority white community. So that effort in Amherst, our effort in Amherst, will look different than in a community that isn't majority white. So it's really about, knowing your community and then really linking arms with other people who are working on reparations to see what's working, what's not, and being really creative about that.
So the task force, we meet again in person in Oakland, December 14th and 15th. We met in September in Los Angeles at the California Science Center, and we came up with the idea for Oakland. We want to invite different localities within the state of California who have already established local reparations task force and pending. So in my research and trying to figure out who is in charge of these different localities, I found Palm Springs, Santa Monica, Oakland, San Francisco, Los Angeles. I think California has the most local reparations initiatives for African Americans than any other state. And so in an effort to just make sure that we're all on the same page in the state of California, we're inviting the leaders of these local reparations initiatives to discuss what's going on in their different cities. Again, December 14th and 15th. But to answer your question more pointedly about, what could other localities or states take away from the California Reparations Task Force? For instance, Illinois is going to be the second state to have an established reparations task force for African Americans. I've connected to some of the people who've already been appointed. And then there's other states that are still in kind of the legislative phase. But in terms of, I think, the two takeaways that I think states and localities can learn from California Reparations Task Force, one is the interim report that we just released. As I said in my opening remarks, it's 500 pages, 13 chapters long. In each chapter, there is a section that clearly describes California's role in perpetuating these different atrocities against the African American community, again, starting with the slave trade to present. But in each chapter, there's also a section that clearly describes the federal government's role in perpetuating these same atrocities, and there's also some information around other states' culpability and responsibility. So you can find our report at oag.ca.gov/AB3121. And I say people can use that as an organizing and an educational tool, because that report isn't only centered around California. As I said, other states can also use that as leverage to push for reparatory justice initiatives in their states and their localities, and of course for a federal push as well. I think another part of our task force that I think sets precedent, that I hope spreads across the country, is around who should be eligible for reparations. The task force in California, was enthralled into a 10-month-long debate around this issue, and we came to a 5-4 decision that the community of eligibility should be descendants of slaves. And so I think in light of the oral arguments that we heard at the Supreme Court around affirmative action, in California, race-based considerations is already illegal by virtue of a law called Proposition 209. So you cannot consider race in education, employment, contracting. So for instance, in February, we invited constitutional law scholar Erwin Chemerinsky to provide expert testimony before the task force. And there he said, he would suggest in order to, meet strict scrutiny, we have to, nearly tailor our program to, meet a compelling government interest. And in order to do so, he suggested instead of making the community of eligibility race-based, so instead of all black folks in California being eligible, Dean Erwin Chemerinsky, who's the dean of UC Berkeley Law School, suggested a more nearly tailored decision. So he suggested that the community of eligibility should be descendants of slaves. And so by a 5-4 decision, the task force did come up with that decision. So the community of eligibility will be descendants of slaves. I know we were talking about that on the way here. And so I think that might be the next thing that comes up in the Supreme Court in some years, is the constitutionality around that. And so again, I think the task force is ahead of its time in that regard. So just to sum up, I think people can utilize the report and how we have articulated the culpability not only of the state of California, but the federal government and other states as well. But then also we're ahead of our time in delineating who should be eligible for reparations in a way that we think will pass strict scrutiny, which will be for descendants of slaves.
The importance of Bruce's speech, right? So I don't think, if we're going to be realistic and pragmatic, right, we're not going to have, like 5 million black families all of a sudden get their land back or their property back, right? That's not going to happen. But I think the Bruce's Beach example is incredibly important for a variety of reasons. One is, the case was incredibly, there were a lot of technical parts of getting that land back to that family that involved all units of government in California, at the local level, the county level, the state level, involved a black partner at Sidley and Austin and all his kind of real estate and transactional experience. And it was just, it's good as a demonstration project that it can be done, right? As opposed to it's too hard. So I think that's kind of important. It's also been important just to, as opposed to kind of thinking of the damages in some inchoate, vague way, just having a case study, right? Family who, as a result of eminent domain abuse, paid $14,500, which was grossly under market value when they were paid this in the 1920s. The property's worth $21 million today, right? That's just one family. You can extrapolate from that, and then you start realizing we're not talking small numbers, right? So it's helpful sometimes just to think, just in law in general, like as we're kind of thinking about, sometimes people can better understand a smaller unit, and then you can aggregate from that and get a better idea kind of the whole. And then the last thing I think is important about the Bruce's Beach is, so once again, I'm going to retreat to my area of law, of expertise, of property law. So has anybody heard of the Kilo versus City of New London, the little pink house, right? How many people have heard of Kilo? Okay, so Kilo, for some very strategic reasons by this libertarian, public interest legal organization in DC, the Institute for Justice, they were able to, through some very strategic, strategies to make Kilo the poster child for eminent domain abuse in this country, right? That just hit home to me a few weeks ago. I was at a different conference with Dan, where a Native American activist at that conference referenced Kilo as being the paradigmatic example of eminent domain abuse in the U.S. So let me tell you a little bit about Kilo. The City of New London is a municipality in Connecticut that has been a distressed economic community forever. So they were trying to use eminent domain, whether it was a wise or unwise. They had limited tools to try to economically develop their city. So maybe this was a wise use, maybe it wasn't a wise use. But Suzette Kilo and the 9 other holdouts, because there were 100 of their neighbors that just were glad to sell, because they didn't see anything special about their property. So there were 10 holdouts. They were all paid above market value. So for the non-lawyers in the room, in eminent domain, what you're entitled to is just compensation, which has mostly been interpreted being paying the fair market value for your property. Suzette Kilo was paid 3 times the fair market value of her property. So let's just kind of set that aside for a second. Her property had no historic significance despite the fact that it was pink. The majority, not just proportionately, but the majority of people in this country who've had their property taken by eminent domain are black and brown people, right? Not just proportionate, the majority. Those who have had their property taken who are black and brown almost never get their constitutionally required payment of fair market value. They typically get much less than fair market value, and part of that is they are taken advantage of because of their political and economic and racial status. So it's another form of, we're going to take your property and further diminish your generational wealth, though we have a constitutional requirement to pay you market value. So let me give you some counterpoints. If Suzette Kilo is this great example of eminent domain abuse, it must be that black and brown folks are like eminent domain abuse on steroids. So I'll just give you a couple examples. I'm from California, I'm from San Francisco, she's from LA, we're getting along fine on the East Coast. I try to have that solidarity, right? So have you ever heard of Dodger Stadium? How many people? Mm-hmm. Do you know where that is? Chavez Ravine. Do you know the history of Dodger Stadium? Dodger Stadium sits on property that a couple hundred Mexican-American families owned. The city of Los Angeles came to them and said, we need your property to build a public housing development, and we'll give you first dibs on selecting, right? And then there was a bait and switch, and the property was given to Walter O'Malley, the owner of the Dodgers. Do you know how much those Mexican-American families were paid for their property? Precisely 0, right? So what I think has been helpful, so ever since Kilo came down, I've been asked to speak at various conferences, I've made this point that there's no way, legitimately, that Suzette Kilo could be the poster child for eminent domain abuse. And just contributing to the erasure of the true victims of eminent domain. Just to be candid, at these academic conferences, people looked at me like I was crazy. And after the first one, they're like, oh, there goes Thomas again on this shtick, right? Until Bruce's Beach. And what Bruce's Beach did is it legitimated and validated a more accurate history of eminent domain abuse and an articulation of who have been the actual victims numerically and in a percentage basis, right? So I think that now it's been legitimized. Now I get invited to conferences from some of the same people that was like, there he goes off the ranch again, to talk about this. So I think at least having that recognition, dealing with what had been this erasure in many black and brown communities, is a fundamentally important first step. And now in certain cities, they are doing mapping of where eminent domain had been used, how much people were paid, and who those people were in terms of their race and ethnicity. So I think it's important in that way. It's opened up a discussion and putting us on a better path to a truer articulation of that harm.
So that brings us to an important issue, which is quantification. How do you quantify what reparations are? It's not always as easy as a matter of finding the value of a property and using present value determination on that. You have lost opportunity, you have so many other things that go into it. It may be difficult to even find out who the harm was committed against. We're talking in a governmental way here, we're talking about governments, local, state, and federal governments making reparations, but a lot of private institutions, including the school just not far from here, recently announced $100 million to dedicate toward this effort. One of my first questions is, well, how'd you get to $100 million? shouldn't it be the opposite way? You find out what the harm is, and then you address it and put the money to it, as opposed to the other way around. But it can be difficult, it's very complex. So how do you begin and how do you advance in quantifying what the reparations should be? Jeff, you want to start?
I guess my first reaction is when people say it's going to be really difficult to do, my reaction is, yes, so what? We have like a Social Security Administration. Do you know how difficult it was to set that up? Really, really difficult. And so how do we quantify these damages? How do we quantify what is owed? We get the smartest people in America to sit down, and the one place I'm disagreeing with Thomas, he said these kind of studies may not be necessary. Oh, they're absolutely necessary. They're absolutely necessary to get an idea of what we're talking about. I can tell you right now, any figure that is reasonable, look at it this way. If it's $1.6 billion for 3.5 years of imprisonment and having their land taken from them, what is it for 240 years of enslavement? The number is bigger than anybody is going to be able to calculate. But going through these exercises to try and understand what the numbers are, I think are critically important. And then, with the smartest people in America on a commission, you can start talking about how do we make this real. And I will just say that I think, personally, that individual payments to people are the least important part of any reparatory proposal, because the institution of slavery destroyed and damaged an entire community. And in my view, a reparation for that damage has to be community-based. And there are all kinds of smart people with all kinds of ideas about school, about college, about income taxes, about all kinds of ways that people could engage in a reparatory process. So I have some actual very strong ideas about it, but I'm not going to say them because I'm a criminal defense lawyer. I'm not an economist. What the hell do I know about how this should work? I've got some really strong opinions, but what I want to do is to turn this over to people who can analyze it in a way, and analyze it in a congressional hearing in front of everybody where there are open hearings and we have people talking about it. If you want to just hand out money, that is stupid. And here are the 20 reasons why. If you want to rebuild the infrastructure of America, is there a way to do that as part of a reparatory proposal? If you want to do it this way or that way, and if we get people who actually know what they're talking about, then we can come up with proposals that will work. The last thing I want to say is, some people will say, there are going to be people who get it that don't deserve it. And there are going to be people who deserve it that don't get it. And my response is, point me to any program ever initiated by any government on the face of this earth that didn't have that problem. Every single one has that problem because they're designed by human beings and we never get anything perfect. So will there be some payments that shouldn't be made or benefits that shouldn't be given? Yeah. Some benefits that should be given that weren't? Yeah. That's just the nature of an imperfect program. But to use that as a reason not to go forward is, I don't have quite the adjective for what that is.
I'll just briefly add on by saying, none of the 9 members on our task force are economists either, except for one has an economics background, member Devon Scott Lewis, who's the director of geography studies at UC Berkeley. So in light of that, we actually hired 5 people to serve on an economic consultant team. Some of the people on our economic consultant team are world-renowned, nationally recognized, of course, economists like William Darity from Duke University, William A. Briggs, who was the Dean of Economics at Howard University, He's now the chief economist at the AFL-CIO. We have a California-based economist, Casey Campbell, Thomas Kramer, who is a professor of public policy, and Kristen Mullen, who's a folklorist but co-wrote From Here to Equality, Reparations for Black Americans in the 21st Century with her partner, William A. Darity. And these 5 people are amazing. They have been working very hard to crunch the numbers or calculate what compensation may look like for state-sanctioned atrocities. So I'll just say another thing, in our deliberations, we found that the state of California does not have enough in its budget to close the racial wealth gap, which for instance, William A. Darity's viewpoint is the only way to really achieve parity in this country between Black Americans and white Americans. So, in light of that, what we are deciding to do is, again, calculate numbers for atrocities that the state of California and localities within it are specifically responsible for. In light of what I said earlier, federal reparations is first and foremost a federal responsibility, but that does not negate the fact that the state of California can also atone and provide reparations in the form of compensation for atrocities they are responsible for. So what that meant was, in terms of data, the task force, the economic consultant team, has gathered data, and we have identified at least 5 particular state-sanctioned atrocities that the state of California can provide reparations in the form of compensation. So those 5 state atrocities are unjust property takings. So the economists are figuring out what does it look like to provide reparations in the form of compensation for unjust property takings, abuse of eminent domain. The other state-sanctioned atrocity, we're figuring out what the numbers look like for compensation are health harms to take into account, like Black Californians as Black Americans more generally. We have lived sicker, we have died younger since white folks in this country, since its inception. Devaluation of Black businesses is the third state-sanctioned atrocity. We're figuring out what compensation might look like. Housing discrimination and homelessness. And then the 5th one is mass incarceration and over-policing. And so the economists have, presented on these issues, have provided the data on these issues, and you can look at our past hearings on our website, which is on these materials, and our YouTube playlist for more details.
So, yeah, just a couple things on that point. I think that, Michele, I'm sure you get in.
No, please.
That having academics done your empirical data is not a prerequisite. And part of that I say, across the board, blanket, because oftentimes we've had a racialized pattern of whether systematic data is collected with respect to subordinated people, including African Americans, right? So the very decision not to collect that data oftentimes is racialized. And so if you don't have the data, you can't then say that, well, that's whatever segment or particular demographic within that community is not eligible because we don't have the data. Oh, and it's too bad that there was kind of a racialized history in not collecting that data. But I do think that the data can be very important, right? So I'm just going to give you an example. As I mentioned, in the early 2000s, the federal government, the USDA, settled a class action lawsuit brought by Black farmers against the USDA and the federal government, claiming that the USDA for decades had systematically discriminated against Black farmers in denying them loans or timely loans and participation in other very important USDA programs, right? So there was a lot of hullabaloo around that case. It got a lot of media attention. It was in the Boston Globe, in the Washington Post, in the 60 Minutes. It was all over the place, right? And ultimately, it was called the Pigford versus Glickman case. And then there was Pigford 1 and Pigford 2. But in the aggregate, Black farmers, as a result of those 2 Pigford cases, were paid $2 billion. In an empirical vacuum, that created an environment where it facilitated a lot of manipulation. So you had right-wing media, including Breitbart, who was claiming that this payment, and the payment typically was families, was in $50,000 increments that did not, per the decision, represent anything near full restitution. But the media, these right-wing media outlets basically said this is the biggest fraud. The government is steering billions to these black farm families who don't deserve it at all. They're just getting this massive handout, right? So, but there was no great data that could quantify the harm, although in the very decision the court said this is not representing anything close to full restitution, right? It's the best we could do. I am part of a 5-person research team. We just added a person, so I guess it's 6-person now, called the Land Loss and Reparation Research Team. And one of our first publications was this past May, was a paper in the American Economics Association, where we quantified, we came up with an economic value for the land black farm families lost between 1920 and 1997. The folks on this team are brilliant. There's a professor at UMass Boston, Dania Francis. There's Derek Hamilton, as some of you may know. He's this huge public intellectual. And the 3 other really talented people on the team. So our preliminary estimate in this short paper we published in the American Economics Association was that the value of the land of black farm families lost in that 77-year period is $326 billion. So then you start going back to the Pigford case. And even at that time, in the media, they started referring to this as reparations. And by having that empirical number, it helps you make an assessment, a more intelligent assessment of, is some type of benefit, like where do we put it on the spectrum? Is it purely symbolic? Is it, a little bit? Or does it represent some robust attempt to acknowledge and to make recompense for substantial damage? I think our study, which has gotten a lot of media attention, has kind of put this lie to that Pigford represented reparations. I always say Pigford represented something. So there are some people says it was nothing. I wouldn't say $2 billion is nothing. But it certainly doesn't represent, I think, we can't use the word reparations for that. So I think that's just a case study. But I think that can be applied. There are many areas where we can do data analysis and empirical studies. And I think they're helpful in terms of particular niches, but they're also helpful in terms of the broader discussion. So a lot of the attention that our little articles got, even though it's dealing with black farmers, has been used in reparations discussion more generally.
Sure, I could just briefly say that I think in a municipality, it would be very difficult in towns and cities to have the amount of funding that would really atone for what has happened. And so what we look at is what sort of benefits and maybe community benefits are more of what we'll be looking at in order to really create a robust reparative plan that is not, even just the cost of defining what the quantifiable number would be higher than the amount of money that we have.
Right.
So I think that's what I can add in terms of the local piece.
I was just listening very carefully and heard $326 billion. And so people go, wow. And then I relate that to the Homestead Act, where America gave white settlers about 100 million acres of land for free. And the land that was given to white settlers in the Homestead Act amounted to 1/10 of the continental United States of America. Just let that figure seep in for a minute. 1/10 of the continental United States of America. So when I hear $326 billion for the land from these black farmers, and I'm thinking, compare that to 1/10 of the land of the continental United States, all of a sudden, 326 billion doesn't sound that outrageous. And I'm not saying that means that you then go to the federal government and say, put 326 billion into the reparations pot. What it does mean is that when you go to the federal government talking about reparations, we are talking about a huge investment in the black community, not something that's small and transitory. We're talking on that scale. And so, you know, and the last thing I'll just say is we came up with between $3 and $5 billion in 3 weeks when the country needed a stimulus. When it was so important, $3 to $5 billion in 3 weeks. How much money have we come up with to support the Ukraine and their resistance to Russia? I'm not saying it's bad that we did it. What I'm saying is when it's important, we come up with all kinds of cash. So I really don't want to hear we can't come up with that, or the number is too big, because we have never approached other problems that are essential to us in that same way. The way we approach those problems is, if it's really that big, we got to get up on it and figure out how we're going to do this.
So I want to leave enough time for our audience, both here and online, to ask their questions. I appreciate everyone who submitted their questions online. If you have a question, hold tight. After this, we will start getting to them. But one of my beats is covering the Supreme Court. I've been doing that since 2007. And as Kamilah said, when we were on our way over here, we were talking about the recent arguments in the affirmative action cases before the Supreme Court. I've also covered the challenges to the Voting Rights Act. And in both of those, it seems that there is an effort by the Supreme Court to look, how do I say, constitutionally askance at efforts that are based on race. There is clearly a belief among some in the majority that considering race or doing things on the basis of race is in itself constitutionally impermissible. So regardless of what you think about that analysis, with that in mind, the first thing I thought of, particularly after the affirmative action arguments, is it seems to me that a lot of things may be in peril of challenges, things like diversity and equity, inclusion efforts at public and private employers, since this involves both public and private schools, and things like reparations, if descendants of slaves is considered to be a proxy for race. So what and how, if at all, is knowing that there may be a constitutional challenge afoot in your minds at play, or should be in the minds of people who are considering their own reparation studies, their own reparations committees, and their own reparations plans?
People have been trying to use proxies for race ever since America was created. And so I'll just tell you, I think there are ways, you know, with all due respect to Erwin Terminensky, who is 10 times smarter than I could ever hope to be. If this Supreme Court is going to say that any consideration of race is unconstitutional, then this reparations program and virtually any reparations program will be challenged and will be struck down. And you know, my view is, if that's what's going to happen, then let's make it happen. And let's make them strike this down, because the legitimacy of the Supreme Court depends, they cannot go past America in a way, at least not so far. And I just, you know, I'm listening to like what California did. I just so you know, I completely disagree with the limits on who should be eligible for reparations. And Dr. Darity and I disagree on just about everything. Dr. Darity thinks that reparations payments should be money in hand to people and let them do what they want with it. My sense is that if you are trying, we should be crafting reparations proposals that address the harm, and then saying to the Supreme Court, how in the hell do you address problems that are directed at black people without saying the solution goes to black people? If you're gonna give a solution to people that lived in an apartment building that burned down, then you give it to the people that lived in that apartment building. And so trying to consider proposals that will address racism in America without looking at race are simply insane. And so you can say, yeah, but this is the Supreme Court. And I'm saying, yeah, it is the Supreme Court. So what? If you're coming up with a proposal that's going to meet the standard of this Supreme Court, it is going to be so watered down and so kind of messed up that it won't accomplish the problem. It won't address the problem. And then people are going to say, shut up because we did it. Shut up because we already did it. So in my view, we should craft the best reparations proposals that we can with the best legislative history behind them, showing why we are saying this has to be for black people, however we define that eligible group. And then if the Supreme Court is going to knock it down, they're going to knock it down. And I guess we'll see how much legitimacy they have if that's what they do. But I don't think you can satisfy this majority.
Yeah, all I would say is that the reparations discussion is not new. There should be no expectation that it's going to happen tomorrow. That you have to have kind of a long time horizon. When we talk about the court, we've got to make sure that we're not talking about the court that it's just this like natural institution that just came into being with no other kind of plan, strategies. What the court that we have now is the product of a 50 or 60-year plan. Lewis Powell, before he joined the Supreme Court, had a memo that he did for the Chamber of Commerce, I believe, and he basically said, we need three things on the right. We need to have our own media that gets out the type of messaging that we want to get out to influence the American public and other stakeholders. We need to take over state legislatures to the extent possible or make substantial inroads. And we need to, make substantial inroads to the federal judiciary, right? So the court that we had now didn't just happen. This is the product of 50 to 60 years of planning. Oftentimes on the other side, there hasn't been that long-term planning. So we're always reacting, right? So there needs to be a conscious understanding of how we got the institutions that we have. In some level, it was a brilliant plan. It's been brilliantly executed, right? And the answer is not just to say it's not fair. It's, you got to come up with your own plan. You got to build your own infrastructure, right? And so, I'll just give you an example. A lot of my legal reform work has been at the state level.
Yes.
When I was working, I've been working on this for, 25, 30 years, but, I remember about 20 years ago, I was at some gathering of kind of civil rights organizations, and somebody had brought up my work, and it was kind of poo-poo. They're like, who cares? That's just the state level. All the actions in the federal. And I looked at that and I said, that's interesting because the other side doesn't think that way. To them, it's a both and. They got a federal strategy and a state strategy. And they got a media strategy, right? So whether or not this current iteration of the Supreme Court will be receptive or not, I don't think should be the final answer. We shouldn't always be in a defensive position. The quality of the moral claims, they're not going to lessen over time, right? But hopefully, if that infrastructure is built, whether it's 20 years out, 30 years out, I don't know, I'm not going to put a time frame on it, right? There might be another moment, right? So that's all I would say is that we should not be in a defensive position. We should kind of learn and try to build that infrastructure that might result in a court that's more receptive.
It's a marathon, not a sprint.
Yeah.
And I think that's what I'm hearing, and he's right. This is a long-term plan, and that's how this stuff gets done.
I'll say, as a chairperson, again, of the First of the Nation task force of this kind, my main concern is passing reparations proposals that will turn into legislation that will change the material conditions or the lives of living African Americans. And so respectfully, I don't want to gamble that once-in-a-lifetime opportunity in adjudicating the legitimacy of the Supreme Court. We knew since Dred Scott versus Sanford that this court isn't necessarily legitimate. And so, again, my main concern is passing solid legislation that, again, is going to change the material conditions of those who have been historically impacted, and that's African Americans who descend from slaves in this country. And again, constitutional law scholar Erwin Marinsky, in his expert testimony to the task force in February, told us, pay close attention to the oral arguments in these affirmative action cases because it's closely connected, the outcome to reparations for African Americans. And so again, I think the task force made a wise decision in terms of defining the community of eligibility as descendants of slaves, because the next big argument will be whether descendants of slaves is sufficiently race neutral, whether or not it's a proxy for race. And I will say there are folks in the grassroots reparation space who have already started to do this work. For instance, there's a group called Be the Power, and they've done the necessary work to uncover, for instance, freedmen as a political status. If you paid attention to the oral arguments in the Supreme Court, the Freedmen's Bureau came up a lot. Justice Kavanaugh, for instance, asked Strawbridge, the attorney who is arguing against affirmative action, in your opinion, do you think, the programs that came out of the Freedmen's Bureau, were they race neutral or not? Strawbridge, ironically, the guy who wants to get rid of affirmative action, admitted that the programs that come out of the Freedmen's Bureau were race neutral. And then Kavanaugh said, well, then that begs the question, well, wouldn't benefits or set-asides to descendants of slaves also be sufficiently race neutral? That's where he got caught up. That's where this next, the movement is taking us, is coming up with an articulate argument that being a descendant of slaves, whether we like it or not, it is race neutral. And there should be specific set-asides for that particular group.
I'm loath to stop such a, robust conversation, but I do want to allow a little bit of time for people to ask questions because I know that we have received a lot of questions. I am going to try to go back and forth between our in-person audience and virtual audience. Right off the top, it's a couple of questions that were asked that I think I can answer. A couple of people asked about the full bios of our panel. That is both in the materials as well as dropped in the chat, a full bio for everybody if you're looking for that. Also, a question for Kamilah that was asked quickly is, are your task force meetings live streamed or on video?
Yes, the task force meetings are in person and live streamed simultaneously. You can find it on our YouTube channel, the California Department of Justice YouTube channel, and the link is on this.
Can't you look at past ones too? 'Cause
Yeah,
it seemed like I looked at one of the early ones.
Yes, and you can look at our past series at the California DOJ's Reparations Task Force playlist as well.
Excellent. So I'm going to start in person. We'll start here with the question.
Thanks so much for a wonderful presentation, very enlightening and in many ways inspirational. I have a question that is directed, I guess, mostly at Kamilah and Michele, but it could be addressed by anybody, which is this debate about racial categorization versus genetic or historical categorization is, of course, somewhat unique to the United States in terms of the history of racial slavery and the idea of race as it developed in this country. And I was wondering if you've looked much at other examples of other countries that have dealt with analogous issues, like, for example, Canada is engaged in a very extensive program of not only reparations, but reconciliation, truth, historical commissions for indigenous peoples. We have the example of Germany they're still actually negotiating reparations payments with Poland even now, and the descendants of people who were in the camps. And it seems that in a lot of those instances, and I wanted to get back to something Jeff was highlighting, truth was as much a component of what was going on as was the reparations. And I wonder about that too, about how central that is to what you're doing in California and how you keep that front and center. So 2 questions. The comparative piece, have you been looking at that at all for examples? And keeping the uncovering of the historical truth as being a central component of what you're doing.
Yeah, so in September, at our hearing at the California Science Center in Los Angeles, we invited people, for instance, from the International Center for Transitional Justice and other experts to talk about different models of reparations around the world. So collectively, amongst the task force and those who attended the hearing, we learned together about the different reparations models around the world. Like, for instance, like you said, Canada, Brazil, Argentina, several different places. And so we're, deciding what to take away from these different models or not. Our second and final report that we will be releasing July 1 of this upcoming year, there will be an entire section on international law and comparative models. So we're still, figuring out how to, what to take away from these different models. I totally forgot the other part here. Oh, truth.
Truth.
So important. So important. And I guess I could critique and say that the task force, we haven't necessarily focused much on truth and reconciliation. Over this past summer, we did host a series of community listening sessions where we invited all different types of people, not only Black folks, but just all Californians in general, to talk about what reparations means to them, and talk about the harm people have endured. And so a diverse groups of Californians participated in those types of events. And so, to your point, I think there needs to be a more concerted effort around truth and reconciliation, but particularly on the federal level, because again, reparations refers to foremost to federal responsibility.
I have a question from online that I'll address to Michele. It says, why would reparations be limited to community-based levels? In fact, those communities were comprised of families and whose whole lives of individuals were destroyed. I'm old enough to have listened to the stories of those affected. Justice is not community-based. When you are a community, how do you do reparations knowing that the impacts of what happened aren't limited to your town or city line?
Yeah, I think, I'm not sure if the person asking the question was referring to the earlier conversation about community-based reparations in Amherst. I think given the budget that we have to work with, it's not to say that we'll exclusively be focusing on community-based reparations, but sort of tying in the other question as well about truth-telling, I think that in the local reparations initiative is a really important aspect of the work and the work that we're engaging in right now. We had our first listening session a couple weeks ago, and it was really, I think, quite amazing for the community who showed up to hear the individual truths of Black residents living in their community that they don't see, that they don't have contact with, and to hear those truths be told, hear the truth of my child doesn't have teachers that look like them, and the pain that causes, so it's really important, I think, to have that truth-telling. And then, of course, I think in Amherst, as we move forward, we will certainly be looking at both community-based and direct benefits that will go to individuals.
I think we have a question in the house, over here.
Yes, so...
Hang on, let's let the mic get to you so that our audience, both here and virtually, can hear you.
Great. Thank you to the panelists for making your time, and thank you to the Rappaport Center for continuing the conversation. So I think most people here agree with the moral necessity of reparations. We believe that reparations must be given to the African American community in order to make up for past wrongs. But building on the strategy that Professor Mitchell was discussing, what does that look like? So I've heard it's not receiving land, and some people believe it's not getting cash directly into the hands of Black Americans. So what does that look like? And if it is giving Black Americans cash directly, last year I did some research on this, and I found some concern about pushing a large swath of the Black community into the middle class, where they're met by the perils of the middle class: bankruptcy, insecure home ownership, not being able to receive government subsidy. And is there any concerns about that as this research is progressing?
Well, I'll say again, the 9-member task force, we have a final report coming out in July where the final proposals will be in that report. But I will say again, I went to law school at Columbia Law School, so I got a traditional Juris Doctorate from Columbia, but I also studied abroad and received a Master of Laws in International Criminal Law from the University of Amsterdam Law School. So in that experience, I learned, the history of reparations over time. At first, it was mainly nation to nation, so ironically, losing nations would pay out reparations, but there has been a transition to make it more human rights centered. And so, for instance, the UN General Assembly, they have an international legal definition for what reparations is. So under international law, there are 5 forms of reparations. Compensation or cash is one of those. Restitution, accounting for stolen land, stolen property, real or intellectual, is another one of those. Then there's, rehabilitation, so that could look like free health care, therapy, substance abuse programs, something, for instance, there's also satisfaction, so that's more symbolic in nature, so that could look like a formal apology from culpable parties. The taking down of, Confederate or racist relics and, in its stead putting up memorials that honor, African Americans, for instance. And then lastly, guarantees of non-repetition, so that gets at more structural and institutional policy change. So again, the task force has not come out with our final plan yet, but in the legislative statute that created the task force, AB 3121, it states that our final plan has to comport with international human rights law standards. So what I will say is, although there's no final plan out yet, we do know that the proposals have to include compensation, has to include rehabilitation, has to include restitution, has to include satisfaction and guarantees of non-repetition. And under international law, it is the victim group that decides what they are owed and what their repair looks like. So if the majority of African Americans want a check, cash in hand, who are we to say they don't deserve it?
I just want to ask a follow-up, because it was asked online about other efforts that might have involved things like post-secondary education, high skills training. Are some of the other things, what are some of the other things that reparations can look like?
They can look like any benefit that people can get in America. Anything that would improve the quality of life. And that's why, for me, it's not an either or. It's not cash payments or this other stuff. It's and. There may be some families in America where you can make a trace and say there should be money going to this family for this thing. But there are going to be a lot of families where it's really hard to trace that. And remember, there are a whole lot of records about who you are and who your family is that are gone, that are destroyed. So I think as long as the plan has the flexibility to identify those who have a right to cash payments, and that could be part of a restitution plan, but free college, not paying income taxes, there are all kinds of things where economic benefit could help to raise folks to a different level of living. And that's why I just say we need to get some of the smartest people, and I'm changing my recommendation. I think it's like these 3 people are people that should be here. And there's a reason I'm not saying myself, is because I don't know. I don't have the background that these folks have in doing this. But what I do know is who does have the background. And so let's identify them and put them in a place where they can come up with recommendations, and we can look at them and say, you know what, this isn't perfect, but this gets pretty close to something substantial, as you say, that's going to change the lives of people who are alive right now.
I can't believe that our time is up, but I can't think of a better way to end this discussion. I really want to thank everyone who has attended both in person as well as virtually. And Lisa, do you want to close us out?
I just want to say this conversation has been really extraordinary, illuminating, provocative, so informational and so poignant. There's so much work to do to achieve any type of equity in the United States, and your work and the work you're continuing to do is just extraordinary. So thank you to